So we're going to get started now. I do want to thank everyone for coming out this evening to hear Dr. McCaulley, and we are all looking forward to it. Just a few notes before we have the formal introduction, and that is, if you haven't done so yet, please go ahead and silence your phones so that we don't get that interruption during the talk. And then also, if you do need to use the restroom, the quickest way to do that is just to go through this door here and then go down the hallway, and you'll see overhead signs for the men's and the women's bathroom. And since I do have the pulpit just for a second, I was instructed to give you a special gift from a secret admirer who knows that you're famous there in the back row next to somebody. And she wants to give you a special gift. So.
Am I supposed to follow that? Suddenly I'm coming up to introduce. My name is Martin Dodderwyk. I direct the King Institute for Faith and Culture, and it is a great pleasure to welcome you tonight to our annual Frederick Buechner Lecture. Some of you may know Buechner's work. Fred came to open what is now the King Institute in 2008 in January. He came back a second time. He's a novelist, a writer of memoir, writer of sermons, a writer of essays, and someone who has helped many generations of Christians now think about the way that faith intersects with culture. And it's in that spirit that we decided this year to welcome Esau McCaulley as our Buechner lecturer, because many of the things that he does mirror the work that Buechner did. Now, before I introduce Esau, I've got a couple of announcements, and I will forget them if I don't give them first. So we start with the announcements, then we'll move on to the speaker himself. First of all, if you were here for the reception and you thought that's great food and you want to take some of it with you, or if you were not at the reception and you feel cheated that you were not here for that food, there are going to be some to-go boxes in the chapel just through this door, and you're welcome to take one, take two, and go enjoy some more of the food from our cafeteria. Second announcement is to let you know that next week is our final event for the fall semester, and it's going to be a professor of law from the University of Virginia. Her name is Barbara Armacost, and Barb is going to be speaking about a theology of policing. And if you know Esau's book, Reading While Black, you know that there's a chapter about policing in that book. So her reflections as a law professor will go seamlessly forward from the conversation we're having right now with Esau. She'll be at Central Presbyterian Church next Monday night at 7 p.m. She'll also be on the campus at King at 9:15 in the morning. So if you can join us for that, please do. Our spring schedule is not quite fixed. There's a couple of moving targets I'm trying to get to stop moving. So our spring schedule will come out soon, but we will begin with our annual Martin Luther King event, which will be on Martin Luther King Day, and the speaker is Anika Prather, who used to teach classics at Howard and is a leading scholar of the Black intellectual tradition. We'll welcome her in January. Fred Buechner, as I mentioned, is somebody who found a career writing, but it followed some time in the pastorate. His time was as a chaplain at Phillips Exeter School, and there, during his chaplaincy, he encountered a lot of the difficulties of normal pastoral life, but he also found himself called more and more to putting pen on paper. Apparently later in life he questioned this. Was this really the right move? Should he have left that position? But he found himself moving more and more to what he thought was a ministry of words. And it's that ministry of words that I think Esau has taken on as a kind of Buechnerian mantle as he comes to us tonight. A way of communicating with vulnerability and honesty and hope that speaks to each of us personally. If you've read How Far to the Promised Land, then like me, you feel like you already know Esau, and you feel like you've already been ministered to in some important ways. And so I love that connection that brings us to the work of Fred Buechner, who has been so dear to King for so long, in the way that Esau does what he does. If you don't know him through his books, they are available for sale at the end. We will have a book table in the foyer, and he might even sign it for you. The books are Reading While Black and also How Far to the Promised Land. I think we have some copies of your children's book as well. I should mention, because I left it out earlier, that he did publish a commentary on Galatians. Oh, dissertation. So if you're really interested, I want to promote that dissertation on Galatians. I think it has not gotten a sufficient attention, just like my dissertation on early Scottish Protestantism. We'll make you a 2-for-1 deal on those 2 dissertations if you're really interested. 2 Scottish dissertations, we'll call it. I can see the possibilities unfolding. Esau grew up in Huntsville, Alabama. He went to the University of South Sewanee, and then went to Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, which turned out many, many fine other graduates, including me. I'm just going to throw that out. He then went to the University of St. Andrews. At St. Andrews, he studied with N.T. Wright, who is probably known to many of you as an author on the New Testament. He has been a pastor as well. He's pastored for a good few years, and both in youth ministry and in parish ministry. He has taught at Northern Seminary, and he has now been for about 5 years at Wheaton College in Illinois. He also writes for the New York Times. You'll see his column about once a month in the New York Times, and he's about to take a sabbatical in which he will not have to do any of the things he's been doing for the past several months, traveling nonstop, but he'll get to go to Oxford, and there among the sleepy spires of Oxford work on 2 different books. So it is a delight to have him here at this moment, and I would ask you to join me in welcoming Esau McCaulley.
Thank you all for the kind welcome and for all the hospitality that you've shown me over the last few days. I can see the people of Bristol have the same idea of hospitality they do in Huntsville, which is to feed you until you explode. And so I buttoned my jacket to make sure it still buttons. And so I didn't eat too many of those ribs last night, but I ate enough. So I've been fed well, so thank you. I appreciate that. And I really have thoroughly enjoyed my time here. This is a very warm community and a great place. It may be something of a truism, or maybe a cliche to say that Jesus was a storyteller, right? Told parables, a spinner of tales. And we have in our mind this enigmatic, quirky Jesus who just tells these obscure parables and kind of just walks away, right? And this Jesus that we imagine as being kind of has this faraway look in his eyes never offends. And his causes for crucifixion are lost upon us. Who would ever kill a storyteller? A nice guy with his heart set on nothing more than saying sentimental things about love. This Jesus, right, with the distracted air, is not too different from the blonde, blue-eyed Jesus, who carries freshly laundered lambs upon his shoulders, right? Smelling almost of mint, right? You can kind of like these. Sorry. Every time I see that image in my head, it makes me laugh. But like those sheep feel like sheep you actually want to hang out with. Do you meet a real sheep, right? And we're right to push back upon this idealistic portrait of Jesus, right? But it leaves the question, right? What role does story and narrative play in the Christian imagination if it's not just spinning parables? Because there's this strange tendency in my field of biblical studies, especially in New Testament, to look down upon narrative. Serious theology, I say this in the Presbyterian church, might get in trouble. Serious theology occurs in Paul's letters. We wrestle with issues like justification, sanctification, election, and eschatology, right? Real Christians read Romans and Galatians. The Gospels are devotional literature. And the Old Testament is simply background to the main story. But if we were to take a moment to look at the phenomenon of the Bible, we will see that God seems stubbornly committed to narrative. Even the Torah, which we think of as law, contains mostly narrative. And there's also a surprising amount of individual stories. The opening of our Bible contains extensive discussions of Jacob and Abraham and Joseph, who dominate that portion of the book. The scriptures, have you ever thought about this, that are meant to shape the imagination of believers are largely poetry, song, and story. I think that God gives us so many stories because in part that's the human quest. A defining struggle is to find the correct story. To answer this question, what kind of world do I inhabit? Who is in charge here? Do the events which happen to me have any larger meaning than they're just the latest event that has occurred in a topsy-turvy, out-of-control world? The central claim of the scriptures is that despite the multitude of experiences, traumas, and miracles, there's only one grand story, ordered by the storyteller, who brings order and meaning to all of our lives. As strange as it may seem, in a world marked by war and rumors of war, of tragedies, global and intensely personal, we live in a story being told by God. But this God is not some grand puppet master moving the pieces around to fight away his boredom. My children do not love me until I take away the television. Then all of a sudden they come to me and say, "Dad, entertain me," right? God wasn't bored and set us to work to give him something to do. He is not simply the originator of this story, but he has entered the story. God has intervened. He is the main character in our narratives. He appears and fits and starts to the matriarchs and the patriarchs. He reveals himself in Exodus and creation, but most fully in the person of Jesus. The scriptures present Jesus as the climax of the human story, a narrative, a series of biographies. Christ then is the denouement, the resolution that does not answer our questions with a syllogism. What will we do about the stories that we inhabit? With the long sought after act of love that reorders all of our hopes. But Christ is a bloody, a triumphant champion. That ought to tell us something about the Christian story. That our journey into the grand story will not be a simple one. Our stories, like history itself, are cruciform, patterned after the cross. That means we will all have our share of heartbreak and beauty. For the Christian, if he or she lives long enough, there is no laughter without a hint of melancholy. So why then write a memoir? Why tell stories? I think we need individual stories like we need argumentative Christian theologies, because narratives are an entry point into the wider account of what God is up to in the world. I heard it said somewhere, and I think I'm allowed to say this amongst the Presbyterians, that we need saints. You all have saints? Maybe there's Christians you really like. I'll just call it that way. We have Christians that we really like because their lives are living exegesis of the gospel. They show us how the gospel takes root in the lives of individuals and the fruit it produces. But I ran into a problem. I am no saint. And so my story cannot reveal to you sainthood. Instead, I hope that my story can reveal something about the pursuit of a black family over the long and winding passage of time. So, how far to the promised land? What is it about? Or maybe even what is in the title? In actuality, the title does not come from the Exodus event, nor is it even actually a mention of heaven. If I was in charge of the world, I would have called the book The Vine and the Fig Tree, but they said you're being too poetic. Bring it down a little bit. But there's a motivating text that was in my mind as I worked on this manuscript that is in front of some of you. It actually comes from the book of Micah, chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. And it says the following: they would beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Any one of y'all who's raised by the King James Version says, neither will they study war anymore. But everyone will sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one will make them afraid, for the Lord Almighty has spoken. According to the prophet Micah, the people of Israel will one day find themselves in deep distress. And then God's going to come back, call them forth from the exile to which they've been cast, and bring them home. There'll be no more violence, no more death, no more fear, but everyone will have a place under their own vine and fig tree. Anyone who knows anything about that language of vine and fig tree has actually become something of a trope in African American literature, appearing again and again in works of fiction. As a matter of fact, Amanda Gorman alludes to the vine and fig tree during her inauguration poem in 2020. Was it 2020? My brain is all broken. Pandemic time. Okay. So the vine and the promised land is about a place of safety. It's not about my journey to heaven, but my desire to find a home. It's about the desire of black people over generations to be able to live free and unmolested, not afraid that we're going to come in and steal what their hard-earned labor has provided for them. In 2017, one might have assumed that I'd arrived at something approaching this promised land. I'd completed my PhD at the University of St. Andrews and gotten my first job at Northeastern Seminary in Rochester, New York. And I got a phone call in the middle of the night saying that my father had died in a single-car accident. He was a truck driver, and he had dropped off a load in California and was returning to the South. Now, my father hadn't been a part of my family consistently when I was a child. He struggled with drugs and addiction, and he'd been in and out of jail. And when he had been in our family, he had been abusive. And so his presence was chaos, and his departure had sent our family tumbling down the economic ladder. And so I didn't know him very well. But nonetheless, my family quickly coalesced around the idea that it would be my job to give the eulogy. What is a eulogy? What is actually a eulogy? It is an attempt to tell the story of someone's life. It's a construction of a narrative. If you're a clergy person, you're not just telling sentimental stories. You're trying to place the person's life in the wider context of the purposes of God. What was God up to in this person's life? And anyone who's ever done a eulogy, one of the things that you do is you sit down with their friends and their family and you say, tell me about this person who has lived. And since I didn't know my father very well, I had to sit down with some of his siblings who were still alive and other people in my family to say, explain my father to me. And what began as an attempt to understand my family quickly became my father quickly became an attempt to understand my family, because I realized that being cut off from him, I've been cut off from the entire history of that side of the family. And it expanded out from him to my great-grandparents and my grandparents. And I realized something that became really clear, that I was actually not trying to simply make sense of him. I was trying to make sense of a black family, because one of the things about being poor, black, and Southern is that all of American history is kind of dumped into your lap. One of the things I've learned about money, maybe y'all don't get this part, but I didn't know about it till I met rich people. But money is a great buffer. You can move to a neighborhood where there's just no homeless people. You can move to a place where there's no violence and no danger. So the things that happen in history you read about, but you didn't experience. But if you're poor and you're black and you're Southern, Jim Crow and tenant farming lands in your lap. That's a part of my family. If you're poor and you're black and you're Southern, then the reality of anti-black racism and segregation and the civil rights movement happens to my family. The war on drugs happens to my family. The stereotypes of the welfare queens happens to my family. And so the story of any poor black family in the South over the course of 100 years is the story of America. And the question became, where is God in that story? So it began then as a study of my father began as a story of my family. Hard Fought to the Promised Land, then, is a story for people whose journey towards God is over and through family trauma, poverty, and anti-Black racism in the South. I'll speak about each one of those in turn. I'll probably start with the family trauma first. And recently, I've been comforted by the Joseph story as I thought about my own narrative. Because his adulthood was forever shaped by the betrayal of those closest to him. Right? That Joseph is sold into slavery by his own family members. One of the things that's really odd as I return to the Joseph story from this lens is you rarely see Joseph wrestling with this idea in the narrative. We don't see Joseph being introspective about how this betrayal hurt him. He only really speaks about it once in the early part of his narrative. This is the place where Joseph is now in prison, and he's speaking to the cupbearer. And he says, this is an amazingly instructive sentence. He says the following: I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here, I've done nothing to deserve being put in my family's dungeon. Even in this context, in prison, he cannot bring himself to speak of his family's role. That I was betrayed by the people who are closest to me. But he had to think about it, right? He sat in that dungeon week in and week out. He thought about the fact that the people who he loved, whose job it was to care for him and protect him, had betrayed him. That is his story. Joseph then has to make sense of God in the context of family betrayal. There's this reality that you might ask yourself then, how does Joseph do it? How does Joseph maintain a belief in God when the people whom he trusted turn on him? There's actually a refrain that is repeated in numerous key points in Joseph's narrative. I'll just pick one at random from Genesis chapter 39, verse 21. It says, the Lord was with him. So the question might be raised then, how did I manage to stay Christian in the context of a world in which I had a father who was hooked on drugs and who sometimes came into our home and was violent? One of the things about dealing with people who are addicts is you don't know which person you're going to meet. The person who is kind and funny, who's the life of the party, whom everybody loves, or the person my father became when the drugs took him over. And this question then of the suffering of an innocent child, how could a good God allow something like that to happen? And I want to answer this with as much, it may seem like it has more of an edge than I intend, but I'll just put it this way. I maintain my faith in the context of suffering is because God was there when y'all weren't. What I mean by that is that if you survive poverty, and you make it to college, they give you books, lots of them. And these books have amazing ideas that teach you about how God isn't real, and they critique his existence, and they speak about God's inability to help the suffering peoples of the world. And they say, now that you made it to our university, we will explain to you the intellectual path forward. And I said, that might be good, but when I was actually in that room, alone and afraid, I know who was in that room with me. It was God. And secular humanism and the variety of worldviews and the people who tell me how I should and practice my Christian faith, who say that you're too woke or you're not woke enough, you know what? Kick rocks, because God was there with me. I remember when I was in Scotland doing my PhD, and every now and then they had these Christian groups, and the Christian groups, I think this is who organized it, had a debate around the existence of God. There was an atheist on one side and a Christian on the other side. Two white guys. Nice British accents, I think. I don't remember the accents. Maybe Scottish, because that would have been really great. Because if you say sovereignty of God in a Scottish accent, you just automatically believe it. Anyways, I think most people became Presbyterians because the Scots became Presbyterians first, and that accent has converted the world. Anyways, different theory for another day. And they're sitting there, and they're debating the existence of God, and one of them brings up the suffering of innocent children. I think it's like AIDS in Africa, malaria. I think the atheist might have said. And then the Christian begins to argue with the atheist, and they're going back and forth about whether or not a good God can exist in the context of the suffering of these people over in Africa. And I looked around, and I don't know if y'all ever been to Scotland, but it's not the most diverse place in the world. So I'm not from Africa, but I'm African. Right? So I almost thought to myself, do I get a vote? Do the people who suffered, have we earned the right to articulate the meaning of our suffering? And if you listen to the Black testimony in these yet to be United States, the testimony we've given over and over again is that we survived because God was there with us in our suffering. And this brings me to my second point. So how far to the promised land? The journey towards God sometimes comes in and over and through in the context of deep betrayal by the people who love you. But my journey towards God did not simply involve family trauma. As a matter of fact, when I speak about family trauma, that's usually the most well-received portion of my talk. Because in some sense, all of our families disappoint us and break our hearts in different ways that people can identify. But my story also involves anti-Black racism. This is an interesting thing that happens in certain contexts. You begin to tell these stories because people sometimes get nervous and they feel like talking about racism feels divisive. Why don't you put these things aside and focus on the gospel? But what I want people to understand is it is precisely in the context of an anti-Black world that I have to make sense of God. Because the question that was pressing down upon my soul, does God care about what is happening to us? And part of what it means for me to be a Christian is to say, God does care. So if I eliminate the racism from my story, I'm downplaying the glory of God. Because it's precisely there, in that suffering, that God came and met me. I try to explain it this way. Imagine you had someone who was a cancer patient. And part of their testimony is the goodness of God in the midst of their suffering through cancer. You told them, don't talk about the cancer, it makes me sad. Well, no, that's where God is, in the broken part. So part of me making sense of my own story is to say, my family was directly impacted over generations by anti-Black racism. My grandfather tells the story of growing up on a tenant farm run by a man named Reuben Miller. My grandfather said that he started picking cotton when he was 4 years old, alongside the 7 other people who were in his family who worked for the farmer. And when my grandfather, Theodore's grandfather, who he was living with, would go to Reuben Miller at the end of every year, no matter how much cotton they picked and how good the crops were, they were told at the end of every year, you just barely broke even. This is the 1940s and 50s in the South, so you didn't negotiate with white landowners that can get you killed. So my grandfather was economically exploited. He said they would take the Black kids out of school during harvesting time, and they would get further and further behind in school, while that same family had children who stayed in school and whose clothes and food and house were funded by my grandfather's labor. So my grandfather, by the time he reaches middle school, his freshman year in high school, he's nearing 17 years old, and he realizes I'll be a grown man by the time I graduate, so he has to drop out of school. So why does my father initially not receive a high school education? Was it because he was intellectually incapable? Or was it because he lived in the South and didn't think it was worth their energy to educate a Black man? And we all know that the biggest predictor of the educational attainment of children is the educational attainment of their parents. So my mom was raised by someone who was undereducated because of anti-Black racism. That's not a hypothesis, it's a fact. And I talked to my mom about what it was like to go to integrated schools. Brown Board of Education happens in 1954, but my mom doesn't enter her first integrated school until she's in the first grade years after this is passed, because the massive resistance to integration in the South led to the shutting down of schools and the refusal of black students in. What happens to my mom when she's a first grade little black girl and she's in a school where they don't actually want her there? And she taught well and fairly and equally. My mom tells the story of what it was like when she was trying to get into this honor society that she knew was key to getting into college. And she said no matter how well she did in school, no matter how good her grades were, the people in the committee kept saying to her, "You just weren't the right fit." I remember when I sat down with my grandfather, and I asked him, I said, "Grandfather, what was it like when Brown Bridge Board of Education finally passed?" Because I remember reading about it in the history books. And there's the picture, have you all seen this picture of the girl sitting on the stage, sitting on the steps, I think it's in DC, and she has a newspaper, and she's showing it to her daughter, saying the schools are integrated, the schools are integrated. And I asked my grandfather, I said, "What did you do when Brown Bridge Board of Education passed? Did you celebrate?" He said, "I didn't know." He said, "We didn't have a newspaper or radio, so it was a day like any other." In other words, the things that we see as history, these seminal marks that represent these shifts in the American narrative, actually aren't as clean as we like. And the long tail of racism follows us, no matter how quickly we try to escape it. I remember when I was in, I think, middle school, and you all might remember the Rodney King case. I try to explain it to young people. It's kind of hard to explain. Before phones had cameras on them, just imagine like a big phone without like a dial, and you had to put a tape in. It's hard to imagine. Just imagine a big old phone, and people carry it around. It's hard to explain. But they had this thing called a video camera, and they happened to have a video camera out, and they videotaped the beating of this black man named Rodney King. It was like our George Floyd incident. It was all over the news. I remember my mom sat me down for the first of many conversations. I think I was in middle school. I couldn't drive at the time. He's talking to me about wearing a seatbelt and using the blinkers and yes, ma'am, say yes, sir, and no, sir. No matter what they ask you, you obey their request. What does it mean to try to make sense of God in the context of this black body that I carried around the South? I remember one time I was heading to the mall with a group of my friends, and we were planning to go to a party later on that night, and we saw some friends who were at the gas station, and so we pulled over to get some gas, and they told us about a better party than the one we were going to attend. We had a brief conversation, and that was the end. So I'm filling up my gas tank, and all of a sudden, an SUV comes up behind me, really close. It's like, wow, like I'm going to be finished pumping gas in a minute. Calm down. And then next thing you know, there's an SUV on the side of me and an SUV in front of me. And my initial fear is, oh my goodness, I'm about to get carjacked. But the people who come out are not actually people who are here to take my car. It was an undercover sting operation in the city of Huntsville. They rush our car and they surround it. They say, "Get out of the car, get out of the car, get out of the car." And I asked the officer, "What have we done?" And he said, "This place is a well-known drug spot." I also thought it's also a well-known place to get gas on the way to the mall. I thought that, actually. I didn't say it because I listened to my mom. So they take us out of the car and they sit us on the side in front of the gas station. As people come in and out, people can see us. They go up and down the university. They take everything out of our car. They dump out my trunk. And they didn't find anything because we weren't actually selling drugs. And I remember having seen it on television that you can find out about the police officer's badge number, and you can later on go and report them. And so I asked the police officer after he had searched our car if we could have his badge number. And he puts his hand over his badge and he drives away. Now, this kind of story may seem fantastic, but they could be multiplied. But that is not my aim. My aim is not to say anything about police officers or say anything about America. It's to ask you this question. Where is God precisely in the reality that some people claim that I do not experience? That's the question I was faced with, right? Does God care about what's happening to us? Not once, not twice, not just to me, but to my mom and to my grandparents, and to my great-grandparents. How far to the promised land? I concluded, and I became a Christian, and I stayed a Christian because I concluded that God did see. And based upon the readings of the Jesus that I encountered in the Gospels, he cared. But here's the thing that I found most compelling about the person of Christ. That he did not simply give me tools to critique the society in which I lived and moved and had my being. He also gave me tools to critique myself. That it wasn't simply that I was someone who was victimized, but in other different ways, I had also harmed people. That I too was broken and in need of forgiveness. That Jesus offered in his life and his teachings a combination of justice and the pursuit of holiness that captures my imagination. The difficulty that comes with telling a story like this is that it may treat black life in the South as an unending barrage of suffering. Its only purpose is to bring empathy. Because in some senses, the tears, the difficulties of being black in America is easy to articulate. But the harder thing is to show the beauty. Unless you've ever been in my neighborhood, you might not have seen it, right? Unless you've actually had my grandmother's red velvet cake, or German chocolate cake, a lemon meringue pie, sweet potato pie, pumpkin pie, or her chicken, or all of it. You fed me most of it while I was here, right? The joy of a black family around a meal, despite the fact that we didn't have as much as we would like, is a thing that's hard to articulate. What it's like to be in a black church and have a gospel choir force you to have a hope that does not reside within you naturally. It's a wonder to behold. It's not a beauty that makes black life in the South complacent, but it makes it survivable. One of my favorite moments when I was in school, young kid, elementary, middle school, was a basketball game I played with a bunch of drug dealers. Me and my friends had come to this park where everybody kind of comes, and we were there playing basketball, and these guys pull up in one of their cars with the bass and everything. They get out of the car. You never know what you're going to get when people come out of the car and what they're going to be like. But they came and they happened to be in a good mood. They brought actually a wine cooler, like what do you call those things? Where you carry all of the alcohol. What do you call those coolers? A cooler. They had a cooler. So they had a bunch of beers there. And I don't know if they had never been to Alabama before. They seem to be indigenous to the region. But Alabama, it gets hot in the summer. And so what started off as a cool day at 10 o'clock, by the time you hit noon, it's really, really warm. And if you drink a lot of beers, and then you run around and you get sweaty, you get a little bit dizzy. And so midway through the game, what started off as a rout on the other side turned in the young kids' favor. And we beat the older kids. Oh, it was so much fun. They're stumbling around, we're crossing them over. It was great, they were laughing. And I remember thinking, I've never had that much fun in my life. As a matter of fact, some of the people who were drug dealers in my community were the ones who would tell me to stay in school. Say, you don't want to be like us. They were the ones who would sometimes give you a 20 when you didn't have any other money to buy yourself a decent pair of shoes. But I also knew that those same drug dealers who were kind to me on the basketball court, who would encourage me to stay in school, who would give me $20 or a $100 bill, more money than I'd ever seen before in my life, were also the people who sold the drugs that ripped my community apart. And that was the truth about my life in the South. That people can be profoundly kind and profoundly broken at the same time. And it taught me something about the grace of time. That the whole point of bearing with broken people is in the hope that in the fullness of time, the good part might win out at the end. The whole point of being a Christian is as long as someone draws breath, there's the possibility of a plot twist. That what other people might dismiss as worthless in your community contains people who loved you when no one else did. We tend to think that it's only the successful lives that are instructive, but I think it's the complicated ones as well. My great-grandmother, Sophia, was something of a legend in our family. She's the fountain from whom all things flow, and were it not for her, I don't think my family, besides the biology, but her character left a mark on us. She was also born in the Jim Crow South about 20 years before my grandfather in the 1920s, and they definitely didn't think it was worth the energy to teach a young black woman how to read, but they said that she was smart. She's a hard worker, but even though through most of her life she signed her name with an X. And she started off on the cotton fields, just like my grandfather would later. She was a hard worker. In addition to picking cotton, she also became a midwife, helping bring young black babies into the world. In addition to being a midwife, she also was a cleaner. She would clean the homes of white families. And between tenant farming and midwifery and cleaning, she managed to buy some land. Huntsville, Alabama. Well, actually, outside of Huntsville. That's actually the land where I spent the first 5 years of my life. And it seemed like at the early part of our family story, we would get our vine and our fig tree. That Sophia had built a life for herself as a black woman who bought land in Alabama. But in the 1950s, there was a fire on that land, and the main house that they had built for themselves was burned to the ground. And Sophia and her husband had this idea. They would go to a white family to take out a loan to pay for the repairs on the house. Both of them were illiterate. And to this day, nobody in my family knows the deal that they signed. We do know that beginning in the mid-1950s, they began to make monthly payments on the loan for the repair of the house. And those payments continued through the 60s and the 70s and the 80s until she passes away. That debt then is passed on to my grandmother. And that same loan is paid back in the 80s, the 90s, till she dies, some 50 years after that original loan was taken. And that land actually reverts back to the original family that owned it. In a strange twist, I found out after I finished researching the book, is that eventually the family that reclaimed that land, when they passed away, they donated the land to a church, now owned by a white church. And you might hear a story like that, the robbery of my family over a 50-year mortgage, roughly, and think, well, that's a sad story. But I want to say that's not a commentary on my family, that's a commentary on America. And the question is, are we comfortable in America that treats black people like that? Because my great-grandmother lived with integrity. She worked hard, was honest, was an illiterate woman who could quote you the entire Bible. She did not curse, but she could Bible curse you and melt your face. You did not just disobey, you sinned against the good Lord God. and what I wanted to say about Sophia is that that is not simply a tragedy. There was something beautiful in the life that she lived. And that people need to see that beauty and ask, does that beauty have to only emerge in the context of so much ugliness? Or might we be able to imagine creating a different and better America? For a long time, I felt like my father hated me. That his decision to continually come and go was some kind of weird mental game he was playing with us. But as I began to get older and understand something about addiction, I began to reconsider that action. That my father kept returning home because I think a part of him knew what he was supposed to do. He was supposed to be a husband and a father, but he couldn't figure out how to do it. But that attempt has its own beauty, even if it fails. There's something of God then in the attempt to be that which you're incapable of being, of the straining towards something. In the last years of my father's life, he has something of a end of the road convergence. He has yet another heart attack, and the doctor tells him, if you keep living like this, you're not going to see too many more winters. And for whatever reason, in this particular circumstance, he listens. And he begins to apologize to the people whom he's harmed. And it'd be wrong to say that me and my father ever became anything approaching close. But there was a peacemaking of sorts. The day that he died, right before he died, minutes before he died, he called my mom when he was in California. And he said to her, I'm sorry for all the things that I've done. My goal is to win you back. He had actually said this numerous times. My mom's no fool. She ain't thinking about you. Or I ain't studying you is how she would say it. And she said, I'm going into the movies with my sister. I'll talk to you later. And shortly after that, he said to her, well, I'm sorry. And one of the last things she said to her is, all I can do is pray. He hung the phone up, and he dies shortly after that in California. He was attempting to make his way home. He just ran out of time. There's something, I think, profoundly beautiful in the attempt. It took me a long time, but I think during the course of preparing my father's eulogy and learning about my family, I found God in my father's struggle. I think I even found God in the struggle of my ancestors over time. And in the end, because of all of those things, I found God in my own story. And in that finding, I was welcomed into that grand story, right? Where beauty is marked by its emergence from places of death. Empty tombs, I am told, still speak volumes. Thank you. I have to answer questions.
I got a mic for it.
Okay.
We're going to have some time for questions, and I do have a mic, which I will bring to you if you have a question so we can all hear it. I do want to mention two people who came a long way for this lecture, and I forgot to mention them earlier because they win. If I had a prize, I would give them a prize. One is Nora. Nora came here all the way from Tallahassee. She had read Esau's book, and in the book, if you've gotten there already, there's a bit about German chocolate cake. So she made German chocolate cake. If you were at the reception and you had some of the chocolate cake, it was made by Nora. So thank you, Nora, for being here and for your chocolate.
And am I allowed to speak on the German chocolate cake? I don't grade on the curve. I'm a connoisseur of German chocolate cake, and it was excellent. So good job, Nora. Lectern. Yes.
I'm going to the lectern. Oh, there it is. If you look around, you're going to find that there's one person who came from even farther than Tallahassee. If you find among you the person who looks like he's half Pakistani and half Dutch, grew up in California, Also raised by black folks in California, went to Wheaton College, and came here this morning from a dairy farm in Brattleboro, Vermont. That is my friend Shabir Kamal. Please welcome Shabir. Shabir and I were freshmen in college together a little while ago, which doesn't explain why he hasn't aged, but we're going to leave that where it is. So if you do have questions, should I try the mic, Will, or? Okay, so if you have a question, raise your hand, I'll bring you the mic. I may just hand you the mic. There we go.
Yeah, you rebuffed me this morning. Do you now think that you are telling parables for this new age?
I think that what I said is true, that part of what it means to be a human being is to answer the question, what kind of story am I participating in? And if telling my story helps people find their way into the grand story, then I've succeeded. Why write memoirs? Because you hope that it helps people imagine their life with God. And any true story, if it's cruciform, patterned after the cross, is going to have its share of heartbreaks. But it's out of the backdrop of that darkness that we see the beauty of what the gospel can do in our lives. So I guess in that sense, I guess I'm a storyteller. You win.
What's your question?
My question was, what kind of toys you had when you was a little boy?
Oh, what kind of toys did I have when I was a little boy? I would tell you one of the stories that I was thinking about that doesn't make it into the book. I think it's from an article that I wrote around Christmas from last year. I think it's called Strange Christmas or something like that. You can look it up. But when I was a kid, I used to want what do you call Power Wheels. And we couldn't afford Power Wheels because we were broke. But my grandmother, and I used to pray for Power Wheels. Like, God, please give me Power Wheels. I need this so I can drive around the neighborhood in my 6'4". Anyways, I prayed for this for years and years. And I'm not a small person. And so as a kid, I was able to do the math. I was like, okay, I'm only going to be small enough for this Power Wheels for like one more year. I'm in real danger here. And I came, the food was delicious, right? So I remember I went to my grandmother's house, and there was a Power Wheel in the driveway. And she used to do numbers, and she had hit on her number, right? And she had so much money, everybody got their best Christmas present. So you make sense of that for me, theologically. Was that a Christmas miracle or was it not, right? And this is what I mean when I say it's the complicated life in the South, right? That my grandmother was engaging in, she was gambling, but she was also profoundly kind. And that's the world. The people aren't, it's just this one thing. That we like to divide people up. And we always feel like if the grace of God has finished his work, then God is not at work. And I want to say that God is at work in people who have not yet achieved total sanctification. So when I talk about complicated people, as it relates to presence, that's one of them. Thank you. I had to edit that part of the book, so I'm glad I got to bring that back in.
I could just thrust this into your face and
I know, I could just disappear and fly back to Chicago.
there we go.
Thank you so much, Dr. McCaulley. That was such a life-giving just lecture and talk, and we really appreciated it. So I wanted to ask you, because you talked a lot about suffering in it.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about something maybe along the lines of like, Jürgen Moltmann's concept of like the compassion of God and suffering. How do you feel like maybe in your life, but also in the life of the African American tradition church, that we're holding on to that truth of the compassion of God and God suffering with us in Jesus, being with us cruciform, but also the empty tomb side of it. So how do those two parts, how does the metaphor combine that?
Well, I would say one of the things that I've lived in a bunch of different places, and I will say, I want to make sure I articulate this well. Protestants, the Protestant tradition kind of gets its energy from the Reformation. And so the central presenting issue is, how do I find justification? You see, there's a sense in which white Protestants are forever fighting about justification. We just can't stop talking about it. We're terrified of becoming Catholics. Like, this is Reformation, we're always protecting people from this latent Catholicism. We're terrified of it. And so I'm not saying that black churches don't care about justification. Don't hear me there. But that's not actually our origin story. The origin story of black Christianity in the United States is becoming Christian in the context of the deeply hypocritical wider Christian world, where these people who claim to believe in God are mistreating us. And so the question of theodicy, the problem of evil, is the originating theological problem that permeates black spirituality in America. So if you want to say white Protestantism cannot stop trying to make sense of justification, in some sense the black church cannot stop trying to make sense of suffering. It's in our music. That's why our music feels different. It's in our preaching, it's in the spiritual, it's in the blues. In other words, trying to figure out what God is up to in a world full of Christians who deeply disappoint us. And so what becomes later, what has peaks and valleys in majority white intellectual traditions, is just baked into the black tradition. And so I would say something along the lines of beauty emerging out of the context of pain is almost in all of our music. It's just, they're just intertwined. And it's what I mean when I talk about, I talk a lot about black music. And I want to be as nice as I possibly can. But when I'm listening to some songs and they're like worship songs, the person is just singing the song. It feels like the song is written by an alien and just dropped in and they're singing it. But when you have a gospel choir and sometimes the woman or the man is singing the song, you would think they wrote it, because the feelings of the words are coming out of them in an existential way. And it's not abstract. It's not God is good. It's like he made a way out of no way when I couldn't pay my light bill. There's an imminent practicality in idea of God's descent and being with people. And so I want to say something like that reality, that when your back is against the wall, the only thing that you have is the truth of the thing, and the hope that the empty tomb actually works is all that we have. Well, the reason why, if you listen to black preachers, in just about every sermon, there's a moment where you kind of look at the person and go, did he or she say that? I can't believe they said that. And I call that black audacity, like, wow, I can't believe they said that. And you know why? It's because if you come from a context where you don't have the vote, you have no economic power, you don't have any social power, what do you actually have? The truth of the thing. And so, black writers and preachers are saying, I'm just going to tell the truth. What do I have to lose? When you have money, status, place in society, and you ascend the pulpit, there's a danger that you might lose that. So there's protectiveness and sometimes a studiedness that comes into other forms of preaching. But black pastors will tell you the truth about yourself. And I think that audacity is only possible if you believe in the power of God. I'm sorry, and I'll stop answering this question this way. This is the exact same thing that you see in the Psalms. Why do the Psalms cry out to God for help? You ever asked us that question? You think that's the first thing the psalmist did? You think the psalmist didn't go to the courts first? Right? And go through the normal legal means of getting justice in Israel? What do you do after you've gone to the courts and the prophets and the leaders and nobody else will help you? You know what you do? You sit down and write a psalm and say, God, help us. And then God says, I'm the defender of orphans and widows. Why? Because nobody else will stand up for them. And so confidence in this idea that God will stand up with us when no one else will combines both a deep understanding of the problem of evil and a deep hopefulness that is merged consistently in black preaching and teaching. If I'm wrong, tell me I'm wrong. Any of the black pastors, yell at me.
You touched briefly on God didn't create us just to entertain him, but he came down to be the main character.
Yeah.
I was curious, why did he create us? And then as a follow-up, did he create us then to suffer, to experience him?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part. Can you repeat that?
Just why did God create us if we weren't created to entertain? Are we just created to be a part of his story?
Well, one of the things that is really interesting, and this is the question that kind of plagues all of human history, and the questions of whether or not God tells us everything that we need to know, or if he tells us enough to be able to function. And the account of the book of Genesis and the Bible's basic answer to some of these questions is God created us because he loved us. And part of love, and sorry I'm going to not sound sufficiently Presbyterian for some people, part of love involves freedom, the possibility of rejecting that love. And the rejection of that love creates pain and the possibility of wounds. And so because humanity has, in some sense, rejected God's love and chosen its own way, it's led to us hurting one another. So did God create us to suffer? No. But does love open up the possibility of suffering? Yeah, it does. But it doesn't simply open up the possibility of suffering on behalf of humans. It also opens up the possibility of suffering from God himself. And the really interesting question about this is that God, and this is what I think we have to really wrestle with, when we get to the climax of the story, and the questions like the ones that you are posed or answered, there's possibly, one could imagine, a syllogism, right? And we can read about this. There's tons of people who can give you all kinds of arguments about the existence of God in the context of suffering. This is what the theologians do. They explain to you logically how these things work. This is why these things are necessary and the world has to be created this way and not another way. And so God could have said, okay, everyone, I know it's rough out there. Here is my argument as to why you should believe in me. Point one, you have freedom. Point two, freedom, but he actually doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. What he actually does is he becomes incarnate in the person of Jesus. And he loves us. And he suffers alongside of us. And he dies. And he then poses the question to us, is that sufficient for you to trust me? It's an act of love. In other words, yes, there are logical answers to our question, but God doesn't do that. He tells us a story in which he enters it and he suffers. And the question is, do I trust that God to bring the varied and wandering narrative of human history to its proper end? I do. And do I believe that when I see him, the things that are not clear to me now will be clear to me in the future? So it would be wrong to suggest that I'm a Christian because I have all of these questions answered. There are things that me and God are still talking about. But I've decided that I trust him to answer those questions in the fullness of time. He's given me not every answer that I want, but a sufficient answer for me to trust him. And what we all have to do is look at the story of Jesus and say, does that person there ultimately compel my imagination? Does he pull me out of myself to be more than what I could be on my own? And when I heard that story, did it ring true in a way that I can't quite articulate? That it's a story that I was searching for that I didn't know what it was until I found it. And so it may seem very frustrating when you ask a philosophical question and someone responds with a story. Man, I will say God did it first. And that's not being flippant. And there are, what I'm saying, other people who would answer the question differently. I'm a Bible scholar. You need the theologians to do the other version of this, to give you the arguments from contingency around the existence of God. Are you a theologian? Can you do that? Okay, we have the theologians do that later. Abigail will answer the other version. Okay. Historian, what are you? Your history, right? What? Ethics, same thing. Close enough. I don't know. It's not Bible, then it's theology. Okay. Any other questions?
I have it on high authority that you spent time at Nashotah House Anglican Seminary.
Yes.
And so you have 1 foot in the Anglican Church and 1 foot in the Southern Black Church. How do you connect those experiences together?
If I could answer that question, that would be the book number 4 or number 5. I would say something along the lines of falling in love with the liturgy does not involve the rejection of anything good and true about the Black Christian tradition. And so I'm a child of the Black church. Well, one of the, and that's the people who shaped me. There is a responsibility that you have to the people who loved you not to forget them. That's just a responsibility. So I cannot pretend that I found God when I started enjoying the sacraments and the seasons of the church year. Did it enrich my faith? Yes, it did. But the reason that there was a faith to enrich was because of those people who preached the gospel to me when I was a kid. And so if that makes me a mass of contradictions, then I just have to inhabit that contradiction. But I would just say that it is just, my mom told me when I was a kid, hey, don't forget where you came from. And what I tried to do in How Far to the Promised Land and Reading While Black was pay back a debt, right? So when I ascend into pulpits like this, it's not me that you see, it's Union Hill Primitive Baptist Church in Huntsville, Alabama, and the entirety of Northwest Huntsville, the deacons and the mothers and the church and the choirs and the ushers and the Sunday school teachers and the preachers who would pray way too long. There was this time, I know this is the question you asked me, we had a point in the service, I don't know if they still do this in churches, where they would, and I think the rule is you had to just be 80 or above before you could even sing the song. But they had these deacons who would just come down to the front of the church and kneel in front of the altar, and they started singing spirituals that you can't find on anybody's internet, and it wasn't in anybody's book. I think they decided on the walk up what they was going to sing. Things from the cotton fields. And you just learn those songs by being in church every Sunday. And what does it mean to see someone who can barely walk stumble all the way up to the front of the church and kneel down and sing a song, right, that was passed to them? There was a woman who, Mother Glover, I don't know if y'all have mothers in the church, but they wear all white in the front of the church. She was on a walker. I promise you, I saw her all during the week. She couldn't walk. She'd come up there, but you know when she would put that thing down and run up and down the church? When she got the Holy Ghost. And there she goes. She just got to running. We all thinking, is she going to tip over? Like, no, but you don't stop Mother until she done ran out the Holy Spirit and she goes back on her walker. What do you do with that? Other than you take that story with you and you tell it. And you say, those people who put in a deposit, I owe them. And so, yeah, I'll always say I'm a child of the Black church who also likes the liturgy.
Yeah, related to the earlier talk and then this one as well, I think what I've seen, the genius of the Black church and Black preaching, Black worship, and I found the same thing in poor white Pentecostal circles as well, is radical vulnerability.
Yeah.
With that being said, at a time where the church seems to be in this reactionary mode, where we want to reassert power, dominance, we want our position back in the society, where do you see signs of hope for the church at a time when we don't want to embrace that radical vulnerability?
Man, the question is, when have we ever seen signs of hope for the church? It may seem to be dark, right? So there can be a declension narrative where things are bad now, and we can say, can we get back to what we once had? And I would say the church is always on the verge of catastrophe, and that catastrophe is always forestalled by the grace of God. And I think that we are in a dangerous place in the church. And I have long ago stopped using the analysis of current events to bring me hope, because that's just going to make me sad. I talk about, and I want to get this correct, my history is hazy at this point in the night, but I think it was Plessy, I forget which one, it was the fugitive slave law, went to the Supreme Court, and I think it was like 1855, maybe 57, and they passed a law, and the law said There is no law regarding the rights of a black man that a white man is bound to respect. And you got to ask yourself, you're an abolitionist in 1857, and the Supreme Court has passed this decision. Literally, the highest court in the land has said, you have lost. There was no sign anywhere that anything was going to change. And within a decade from that event, slavery will be over in the United States. Not everything, but slavery was over. And so what do you do if you're there on the other side of that Supreme Court decision? How do you get up and go to work the next day? Continue to push for abolition as they did. Because they had the confidence in the truth of the thing itself. And I function because I believe that the things that the Bible says are true. And that's the basis for my hope. Now I will say this, all bills eventually come due. What I mean by that is there have been, what we're dealing with now, kind of the unraveling and the corruption of the church. You can actually open up the abolitionist literature in the 1800s and people saying all of this stuff about the compromise of the church. And it's marrying the church with political power and forsaking gospel principles. You can read it in Frederick Douglass. Like, it seems like he's talking about right now. You can fast forward to the 1920s and read, I forget her name, she's traveling around protesting the lynching laws in the South. And she's telling you the exact same thing. You move forward to the 1950s and the 1960s, and you have people who are doing civil rights movement who are telling you the same thing. And now we're in the 2020s. And so you have this long history of the black church saying we can and should and ought to be better. And we have, at each point, a significant number of Christians who weren't racist, but who preached moderation and patience until they found out the truth of the thing itself. When the ugliness, they had to face it. And it's like, oh, I didn't realize what this was. You know what the black church says when you finally see it? Told you. Right? Read the letter to the Birmingham jail and what Martin Luther King says about white moderates and transpose it into the present moment. And when I say bills come due, now when that toxicity reaches such a level that even the moderate Christians are finding it uncomfortable, now they're starting to say, oh, I see what these black Christians were talking about. And so I think the bills of delaying these things, and I've always wondered about this. Maybe I'll put it this way. What if in the 1980s, all the churches said, we're going to actually commit to being centered to racial reconciliation and standing with the oppressed while maintaining our theological core values. And the people who actually were going to be upset by this left the churches. So the churches ran out of money and all of the churches closed. Let's say in the 1980s and 1990s, 500 churches closed because they resisted racism. Wouldn't that have been a glorious testimony? That in the year of our Lord, there was not a congregation anyone could run into and not find a resistance to racism? Such that the people said, I can't find any church that's not talking about the relationship between the gospel and the stepped-on peoples of the world. But instead, we compromised. And every time we compromise, we pile up bills that then come due, and then we suffer. And so I think we're in the midst of yet another reckoning. So I really genuinely believe that until churches begin to treat injustice like they treat any other sin. I'm sorry, I don't want to give an entirely free sermon, but I'll say like 45 more seconds worth of stuff, and then I'll leave it alone. I think we all will acknowledge that greed is bad. I don't think there's like a pro-greed faction in the church. But although we know greed is bad, and we all know that we shouldn't do it, we all are kind of a little bit greedy. And we tend to hoard our stuff. We actually need pastors and clergy to remind us over and over again that what we have belongs to the Lord. And the tendency to be greedy and to hoard will be with us until the Lord returns. Nonetheless, we fight materialism every single day of our lives. We believe that greed is not a sin that we can remove from the church. Racism is the only sin that we think we've evolved out of. It's the only one. We can say, I gave a racism talk in 2016, solved. No one did that about tithing, right? And so what I want to say is something along the lines of the tendency to put worth in things that God doesn't put a hierarchy of worth on is a human tendency that will be with us as long as we walk this earth. But like every other sin, we have to resist it until the Lord's return. And it's the fear of publicly resisting that consistently leads the church into these moments of crisis, which I think we're in right now. Do I have time for one more? I'll be briefer next time, I promise.
I'm Roy Mabry, I'm from Southwest Virginia, and I've been waiting and waiting and waiting. And my oldest brother told me this, and I believe him. And I don't know if it's in the Old Testament or the New Testament.
It's somewhere.
It's somewhere. I've read a verse or two of the Bible.
Okay.
And I waited a long time. When are we going to get our 40 acres and a mule?
The language of how far to the promised land and the vine and the fig tree actually gets to that, right? So when I opened up this idea that they're going to one day arrive in a place where there's no one to make them afraid. And I think that one of the things that I can do, what can you do as a writer or a thinker, is I think that people have to be able to imagine justice before they can enact justice. And I think that there is such a fear that if we fully begin to own the brokenness of this country, there's no end to it. That we will kind of wallow in despair forever. But I think that if we begin to ask ourselves or try to answer this question, what might justice look like? We're committed to pursuing it. There might still be disagreement as to how to enact that justice, but the pursuit of that justice could be a common pursuit. In other words, there's this idea that we can just erase history and start from where we are. And one of the things that I was trying to articulate in How Far to the Promised Land is the past is not past, it's not even past. That's Faulkner, right? That it's with us. If the past is still with us, how might we begin to construct a society that is more just? If we can't ask that question, then anything beyond that is a waste of our time. And so what I think that we have to do is, as a society, commit ourselves to imagining that justice. And then you bring somebody else, a policymaker, not a theologian, to begin to help you learn how to enact that justice. And that's not me pushing the question. It's like one of the things that they ask you, one of the tricky parts of being a writer is they want you are sometimes asked to articulate and then solve the problem. And sometimes as a writer, all that you can do is unsettle or activate the entirety of the church. Once you activate the church, then the wider gifts of the body of Christ can come forth and they can solve the problem. So my job is done when I've said there's a problem and you agree. The next thing is to rise to the practitioners who then answer the question, what do we do next? Thank you.
I got two quick announcements, and I'll cut you loose. Let me remind you that you can take a little taste of the Promised Land home with you tonight in the person of those boxes that are in the little chapel over here. You can take another bit of the Promised Land home with you in the books for sale in the foyer. If you want to speak with Esau a bit, you don't have to buy a book, just drop by, but he'll be there waiting for you in the foyer. It is a difficult task as a writer or a speaker to do the two things that you heard tonight, to unveil the pain and the suffering and the difficulty that we all face, and also to unveil the vision of the Promised Land that it awaits. I'm glad you were here tonight. Thank you for coming out. And please join me in thanking once again Esau McCaulley.